Hello, guys. Aw, thank you so much for the follow, Reckless. I am currently in a conversation with my internet provider. Um, okay, cool. So let's see. Today we are having story time with Mama Raiden. We are reading Throne of Glass, and we have come quite far in the book. Are you guys ready? We have reached chapter 41. Um, the clock chimed 10, and Selina, seated at the small desk in her bedroom, looked up from her book. She should be sleeping, or at least trying to. Fleetfoot, dozing in her lap, yawned widely. Selina scratched her behind the ears and ran a hand along the page of the book. Weird marks stared up at her, their intricate curves and angles speaking a language she couldn't yet begin to decipher. How long had it taken Nehemia to learn them? And she wondered darkly, how could their power possibly still work when magic itself was gone? She hadn't seen Nehemia since the ball last night, hadn't dared to approach her or tell Carol what she'd learned. Nehemia had been deceitful about her language skills and how much she knew about the weird marks. But she could have any number of reasons for that. Selina had been wrong to go to the ball last night, wrong to believe Nehemia was capable of such bad things. Nehemia was one of the good ones. She wouldn't target Selina, not when they'd been friends. Selina swallowed the tightness in her throat and turned the page. Her heart stopped. There, looking up at her, were the symbols she'd seen near the bodies, and in the margin, written by someone centuries ago, was the explanation. For sacrifices to the Ridrak, using the victim's blood, mark the area around it accordingly. Once the creature has been summoned, these marks guide the exchange. For the flesh of the sacrifice, the beast will grant you the victim's strength. Selina fought to keep her hands from trembling as she flipped through the pages, searching for anything about the marks under her bed. When the book yielded nothing, she returned to the summoning spell. A Ridderak. That was the name of the beast. What was it? Where had it been summoned from? If it wasn't the weird gates. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes. Someone was actually using the weird marks to open a portal to summon this creature. It was impossible because the magic was gone. But the text said weird marks existed outside of magic. What if their power still worked? But, but Nehemia? How could her friend do such a thing? Why did she need the champion's strength? And how could she keep everything hidden so well? Yet Nehemia could easily be a cunning actress, and maybe Selina had wanted a friend, wanted someone as different and outsiderly as she was. Maybe she'd been too willing, too desperate to see anything but what she wanted to see. Selina took a steadying breath. Nehemia loved Ilwe. That was certainly true. And Selina knew there was. Hi guys, I am back. Internet is back. Internet provider yelled at. Check. Hello, Melon. Wine time, yes. I am sorry, guys, that my internet died on me. Hopefully, it will be better now. Yes. Chapter 41. The clock chimed 10, and Selina, seated at the small desk in her bedroom, looked up from her book. Oh, yeah, come back to ESO, Melon. Yeah, definitely. She should be sleeping, or at least trying to. Fleetfoot, dozing in her lap, yawned widely. Are you still in the guild? It depends on what your in-game name is. Oh, it's you, Tom. You should be. Hey, I cannot recognize you if you're called Melengay. You should be. If not, then you just get an invite back. There have been some purchase. But I will say 4 months, it's highly likely that you're not. Uh, it's usually the 5, 6, 7, 8 months that get purged. So, alright. Selina scratched her behind the ears and ran a hand along the page of the book. Weird marks stared up at her, their intricate curves and angles, speaking a language she couldn't yet begin to decipher. How long had it taken Nehemia to learn them? And, she wondered darkly, how could their power possibly still work when magic itself was gone? She hadn't seen Nehemia since the ball last night, hadn't dared to approach her or tell Kaol what she'd learned. Nehemia had been deceitful about her language skills, and how much she knew about the weird marks. But she could have any number of reasons for that. Selina had been wrong to go to the ball last night, wrong to believe Nehemia was capable of such bad things. Nehemia was one of the good ones. She wouldn't target Selina, not when they'd been friends. Sorry, just had a kid that wanted to come up to the lab. They had been friends. Selina swallowed the tightness in her throat and turned the page. Her heart stopped. There, looking up at her, were the symbols she'd seen near the bodies, and in the margin, written by someone centuries ago, was the explanation. For sacrifices to the Ridderak, using the victim's blood, mark the area around it accordingly. Once the creature has been summoned, these marks guide the exchange for the flesh of the sacrifice. The beast will grant you the victim's strength. Selina just found out what the weird marks means and how you summon the beast. Selina fought to keep her hands from trembling as she flipped through the pages, searching for anything about the marks under her bed. When the book yielded nothing, she returned to the summoning spell. A Ridderak. That was the name of the beast. What was it? Where had it been summoned from? If it wasn't the weird gates. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes. Someone was actually using the weird marks to open a portal to summon this creature. It was impossible, because magic was gone. But the text said weird marks existed outside of magic. What if their power still worked? But, but Nehemia, how could her friend do such a thing? Why did she need the champion's strength? And how could she keep everything hidden so well? Yeah, you did, Ginger. Yet Nehemia could easily be a cunning actress, and maybe Selina had wanted a friend, wanted someone as different and outsiderly as she was. Maybe she had been too willing, too desperate to see anything but what she wanted to see. Selina took a steadying breath. Nehemia loved Elway. That was certainly true. And Selina knew there was nothing Nehemia wouldn't do to keep her country safe. Unless ice moved through Selina's veins. Unless Nehemia was here to start something bigger. Unless she didn't want to make sure the king spared Ailway at all. Well, she knows that Nehemia knows how to read the weird marks, but at the moment it is all unconfirmed. That is Nehemia. Unless she wanted what few dared whisper, rebellion. And not rebellion as it was now, with rebel groups hiding out in the wilderness, but rather rebellion in the sense of entire kingdoms rising up against Ardalan, as it should have been from the start. But why kill the champions? Why not target royals? The ball would have been perfect for that. Why use weird marks? She had seen Nehemia's rooms. There were no sign of a demon beast lurking about, and nowhere in the castle where she could. Selina's eyes rose from the book. Blocked by the giant chest of drawers, the tapestry still rippled in a phantom breeze. There was nowhere in the castle to summon or hide a creature like that, except for the endless forgotten chambers and tunnels running beneath it. No, she said, standing so fast that it was all Fleetfoot could do to leap out of the way in her chair as her chair toppled over. No, it wasn't true. Because it was Nehemia. Because, because... Selina grunted as she pushed the chest to the side and folded the tapestry back from the wall. Just as it had 2 months ago, a cold, damp breeze leaked through the cracks, but it smelled nothing of roses. All of the murders had occurred within 2 days of a test. That meant tonight or tomorrow something would happen. The Ritterrack, whatever it was, would strike again. And with the marks that she found painted under her bed, there were no way in hell she'd wait for it to show up. After shutting the whining Fleetfoot out of the bedroom, Selina covered the passage entry with the tapestry, wedged a book in the doorway to keep from getting locked in, and only once wished she had a weapon beyond the candlestick she carried and the makeshift knife in her pocket. Because if Nehemia had truly lied to her like that, and if Nehemia was murdering the champions, then Selina had to see it herself. If only so she could kill her with her bare hands. Down and down she went, her breath thick in the frigid air. Water dripped everywhere, and Selina looked longingly in the middle archway as she approached the crossroads. There were no thought of escape now. What would be the point when she was so close to winning? If she lost, she'd sneak back here before they'd had a chance to ship her off to Endovier again. Selina studied to the left and right side passages. The one to her left only led to a dead end, but the one on the right, that was the passage she'd taken to Elena's tomb. There she'd been countless other passageways leading to unknown places. She stepped closer to the archway and froze when she saw the steps that descended into the murky darkness. The centuries-old dust had been disturbed. Footprints led up and down. Nehemia and her creature must have been creeping around down here, just floors below everyone else. Hadn't Viren died just after he taunted her in front of Nehemia? Selina clutched her candlestick tighter and pulled her makeshift knife out of her pocket. Step after step, she began her descent down the stairwell. Soon she could no longer see the top landing, and the bottom never came any closer. But then whispers filled the corridor, slithering off the walls. She quieted her steps and shielded her candle as she neared. It wasn't the idle chat of servants, but someone speaking rapidly, almost chanting. Not Nehemia, a man. A landing approached below, opening into a room to her left. A greenish light seeped out of it onto the stones of the stairwell, which continued on past the landing and into darkness. The hair on her arms rose as the voice became clearer. It didn't speak any tongue that she recognized. It was guttural and harsh, and grated against her ears, as if it sucked the very warmth from her bones. The man panted as he spoke, like the words burned his throat, and finally he gasped for air. Silence fell. Setting down her candle, Selina crept toward the landing and peered inside the room. The oaken door had been thrown open. A giant key turned in its rusting lock, and inside the small chamber, kneeling before darkness so black that it seemed poised to devour the world, was Cain. Chapter 42. Cain, the person who had gotten stronger and better at the competition went on. As the competition went on, sorry. She thought it was his training, but it was because he'd been using the weird marks and the beast they summoned to steal the dead champion's strength. He dragged a hand across the floor before the darkness, and greenish lights sprung up from where his fingers passed, before being sucked into the void like wraiths on the wind. One of his hands were bleeding. She didn't dare to breathe as something stirred in the darkness. There was the click of a claw on stone, and a hiss like an excuse me, like an extinguished flame. And then, stepping toward Cain on knees that bent the wrong way, like an animal's hind legs, the Riderack emerged. Hey, Vertigo! It was something out of an ancient god's nightmares. Its hairless gray skin was stretched tightly across its misshapen head, displaying a gasping mouth filled with black fangs. Fangs that had ripped out and eaten Varen and Xavier's internal organs. Fangs that had feasted on their brains. Its vaguely human body sank onto its haunches, and it slid its long front arms across the stone floor. The stones whined under the claws. Cain raised his head and stood slowly as the creature knelt before him and lowered its dark eyes. Submission. Selena only realized she was trembling when she made to step away, to flee as far and as fast as she could. Elena had been right. This was evil, plain and simple. The amulet pulsed at her neck, as if urging her to run. Her mouth dry, her blood pounding in her veins, she stepped back. Cain whirled to look at her, and the Riderack's head shot up, its slitted nostrils sniffing twice. She froze, but as she did so, a massive wind shoved into her from behind, making her stagger into the room. "It wasn't meant to be you tonight," Cain said. But Selena's eyes remained on the beast, who began panting. "But this opportunity is too good to waste." "Cain!" was all she could say. The Riderack's eyes, she'd never seen anything like them. There was nothing in them but hunger, endless, ageless hunger. The creature was not of this world. The weird marks worked. The gates were real. She pulled the makeshift knife out of her pocket. It was pitifully small. How could hairpins make a dent in that creature's hide? Cain moved so quickly that she could only blink before he was behind her. Her knife somehow now in his hand. No one, no one human could move that quickly. It was as if he were no more than shadow and wind. "Pity," Cain whispered from the doorway, pocketed her knife. Selena glanced to the creature, to him, and then back. "I'll never get to know how you wound up down here in the first place." His fingers wrapped around the door handle. "Not that I care. Goodbye, Selena." The door slammed shut. The greenish light still seeped from the marks on the floor. Yeah, girlie in trouble, yeah. Marks Kane had etched with his own blood, illuminating the creature who stared at her with those starving, relentless eyes. Kane, she whispered, backing into the door as she fumbled with the handle. She twisted and yanked. It was locked. There were nothing in this room but stone and dust. How had she let him disarm her that easily? Kane! The door wouldn't budge. Kane! She shouted, and banged on the door with a fist hard enough to hurt. The Riderack stalked back and forth on its four long spidery limbs, sniffing at her, and Selina paused. Why didn't it attack immediately? It sniffed at her again, and swiped at the ground with the clawed hand, striking deep enough to take a chunk out of the stone. It wanted her alive. Kane had incapacitated Verin while he summoned the creature. It liked its bloodshot hot, so it would find the easiest way to immobilize her, and then she couldn't breathe. No, not like this. Not in this chamber, where no one would find her. Where Kale would never know why she disappeared, and would forever curse her for it. Where she'd never get the chance to tell Nehemia she'd been wrong. And Elena said someone wanted her in the tomb to see. To see what? And then she knew. The answer lay on her right. The right passageway. The passage that led to the tomb a few levels below. The creature sank back into its haunches, poised to spring, and in that moment, Selina came up with the most reckless and brave plan you've ever concocted. She dropped her cape to the floor. With a roar that shocked the castle, the Riderack ran for her. Selina remained before the door, watching as it galloped at her, sparks flying from its claws as it struck stone. 10 feet away, it leaped, straight toward her legs. But Selina was already running straight at those black, rotting fangs. The Riderack jumped for her, and she hurtled over the snarling thing. A thunderous, splintering boom erupted through the chamber as the Riderack shattered the wooden door. She could only imagine what it would have done to her legs. She didn't have time to think. She landed and whirled, charging back to where the creature had crashed through the door, and now sought to shake itself free of the pile of wood. She threw herself through the doorway and turned left, flying down the stairwell. She'd never make it back to her chambers alive. But if she was fast enough, perhaps she could make it to the tomb. The Riderack roared again, and the stairwell shuddered. She didn't dare to look behind. She focused on her feet, on keeping upright, as she bounded down the stairs, making for the landing below. Illuminated by moonlight leaking from the tomb. Selina hit the landing, ran for the tomb door, and prayed to gods whose names she'd forgotten, but who she hoped has not yet forgotten her. Someone wanted me to come here on Samhain. Someone knew this would happen. Alina wanted me to see it, so I could survive. The creature hit the bottom landing and charged after her, so close she could smell its reeking breath. The door to the tomb was wide open, as if someone had been waiting. Please, please. Grabbing onto the side of the doorway, she swung herself inside. She gained precious time as the Riderack skidded to a halt, missing the tomb. It only took a moment for it to recover and charge, taking off a chunk of the door as it entered. The pounding of her feet echoed through the tomb as she ran between the sarcophagi for Damaris, the sword of the ancient king. Displayed atop its stand, the blade shone in the moonlight, the metal still gleaming after 1,000 years. The creature snarled as she heard a steep intake of breath and the scrape of nails departing stone as the Riderack leaped for her. She lunged for the sword, her left hand wrapping around the cool hilt as she twisted in the air and swung. She only had time to see its eyes and the blur of its skin before she drove Damaris through the Riderack's face. Pain lanced through her hand as they slammed into the wall and fell to the ground, scattering treasure. Black blood that stank of waste sprayed onto her. She didn't move. Not as she stared on those black eyes, barely inches from her own. Not as she saw her right hand held between its black teeth, her blood already oozing down its chin. She just panted and shook, not taking her left hand from the hilt of the sword, even after those hungry eyes turned dull and into body sagged atop hers. It was only when the amulet throbbed again that she blinked. Everything after that became a series of steps, a dance that she had to execute perfectly, or else she'd fall apart right there in the tomb and never get up. She first pried her hand from his teeth. It burned mercilessly. The English word is quite hard to say. Yet again. An arc of gushing puncture wounds encircled her thumb, and she swayed on her feet as she shoved the Riderack off her. It was surprisingly light, as if its bones were hollow, or there were nothing inside of it. Though the world became foggy around the edges, she yanked Damaris from its skull. She used her shirt to wipe Gavin's blade clean, and set it back where it belonged. That was why they brought her to the tomb on Samhain, wasn't it? So she could see Damaris and have a way to save herself. She left the creature where it lay in a crumpled heap atop piles of jewels. Whoever had wanted to save her could clean it up. She'd had enough. Still, Selina paused beside Elena's sarcophagus and looked at the beautiful face carved from marble. "Thank you," she said hoarsely, her vision blurring. She left the tomb and staggered up the stairs, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. When she were when she was at last safely inside her chambers, Selina crossed to her bedroom door and leaned there, panting, as she unlocked it. Her, her wound hadn't clotted, and blood was still pouring down her wrist. She listened to it drip onto the floor. She should go into the bathing room and wash her hand. Her palm felt like ice. She should. Her legs gave out, and Selina collapsed. Her eyelids became heavy, so she closed them. Why did her heart beat so slowly? She opened her eyes to look at her hand. Her eyesight was blurry, and all she could make out was a mess of pink and red. The ice in her hand reached up her arm down to her legs. She heard a booming, thunderous noise. A thump, 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 followed by a whine. Through her eyelids she could see the light in the room darken. She heard a cry. Female. A warm hand grabbed her face. She was so cold, it almost burned. Had someone left the window open? Lillian! It was Nehemia. She shook Selina's shoulders. Lillian, what happened to you? Selina remembered little of the next few moments. Strong arms lifted her up and rushed her into the bathing chamber. Nehemia strained as she carried Selina into the bathing pool, where she stripped away Selina's clothes. Selina's hand burned when it touched the water, and she thrashed, but the princess held her firm, saying words in a tongue the assassin didn't understand. The light in the room pulsed, and her skin tingled. Selina found her arms covered in glowing turquoise marks. Weird marks. Nehemia held her in the water, rocking back and forth. Blackness swallowed her up. Oh my! Selina opened her eyes. She was warm, and the candlelight was golden. She could smell lotus blossoms and a bit of nutmeg. She made a small noise and blinked, attempting to raise herself from the bed. What had happened? She could only recall climbing the stairs, then concealing the secret door behind the tapestry. Selina gave a start and grabbed at her tunic, gaping as she found that it had somehow turned into a nightgown, and then marveled at her hand as she lifted it into the air. It had healed, completely healed. The only remnants of the wounds were a half-moon-shaped scar between her thumb and index finger, little bite marks from the Ridderag's lower teeth. Oh, she's lucky, wow. She ran a finger over each of the chalk-white scars, tracing their curve, then wiggled her fingers to ensure no nerves had been severed. How was this possible? It was magic. Someone had healed her. She lifted herself and saw she was not alone. Nehemia sat in a chair nearby, staring at her. There was no smile on her lips, and Selina shifted as she beheld the mistrust in the young woman's eyes. Fleetfoot lay at her feet. What happened? Selina asked. That's what I've been waiting to ask you, said the princess in Elway. She gestured at Selina's body. If I hadn't found you, you would have died from that bite within a few minutes. Even the blood she dropped on the floor had been cleaned. Thank you, she said, then started as she looked to the darkened sky beyond the windows. What day is it? If somehow 2 days had passed and she missed the last test. It's only been 3 hours. Selina's shoulders sagged. She hadn't missed it. She still had tomorrow to train, and the test the day after that. I don't understand. How did... That is not important, Nehemia interrupted. I want to know where you received that bite. There was blood only in your bedroom, no traces of it in the hallway or anywhere else. Selina clenched and unclenched her right hand, watching the scars stretch and contract. She had come so close to dying. She flicked her eyes to the princess, then back to her hand. Whatever Nehemia's involvement was, it wasn't with Cain. I'm not who I pretend to be, Selina said quietly, unable to meet her friend's eyes. Lilian Gordania doesn't exist. Nehemia didn't say anything. Selina made herself look her in the eye. Nehemia had saved her. How had she dared to believe that Nehemia might be the one controlling that creature? The truth was the least she owed her friend. My name is Selina Sardothian. Nehemia's mouth parted. Slowly she shook her head. But they sent you to Endovier. You were supposed to be in Endovier with... Nehemia's eyes widened. You speak the Elway of the peasants, of those enslaved in Endovier. That's how you learn. Selina's breathing became a bit difficult. Nehemia's lips trembled. You went to Endovier? Endovier is a death camp. But why did you not tell me? Do you not trust me? Of course I do, she said, especially now that she had proven beyond a doubt that she wasn't the one responsible for those murders. I was ordered by the king not to speak a word of it. A word of what? Nehemia said, blinking back her tears. The king knows you're here. He gives you orders. I'm here for his amusement. Selina sat up straighter in bed. I'm here because he's hosting a competition to be the king's champion. And after I win, if I win, I'm to work for the king for 4 years as his lackey and assassin. And then I'll be freed and my name cleared. Nehemia just looked at her, damning her with that blank stare. You think I want to be here? Selina shouted, even though it made her head pound. It was either this or Endovier. I had no choice. She put her hands on her chest. Before you start lecturing on my morality, or before you run away and hide behind your bodyguards, just know that there's not a moment that goes by when I don't wonder what it would be like to kill for him. The man who destroyed everything that I loved. She couldn't breathe fast enough, not as the door mind inside her mind opened and closed, and the images that Selina had made herself forget flashed before her eyes. She closed them, wishing for darkness. Nehemia remained silent. Fleetfoot whined. In the quiet, people, places, words echoed in her mind. Then footsteps. They brought her back. The mattress groaned and sighed as Nehemia sat. A second, lighter weight joined her. Fleetfoot. Nehemia took Selina's hand in her warm, dry one. Selina opened her eyes, but stared at the wall across the room. Nehemia squeezed her hand. You're my dearest friend, Selina. It hurt me more than I realized it would, to have things become so cold between us. To see you look at me with such distrust in your eyes. And I don't want to ever see you look at me like that again. So I wish to give to you what I've given to few before. Her dark eyes shone. Names are not important. It was lies inside of you that matters. I know what you went through in Endovier. I know what my people endure there, day after day. But you did not let the mines harden you. You did not let it shame your soul into cruelty. The princess traced a mark on her hand, her fingers pressing into Selina's skin. You bear many names, and so I shall name you as well. Her hand rose to Selina's forehead, and she drew an invisible mark. I name you Elentia. She kissed the assassin's brow. I give you this name to use with honor, to use when other names grow too heavy. I name you Elentia, spirit that could not be broken. Selina was held in place. She could feel the name fall upon her like a shimmering veil. This was unconditional love. Friends like this did not exist. Why was she so fortunate to have found one? Come, Nehemia said brightly. Tell me about how you became Ardalan's assassin, and how you wound up in this castle. Exactly, and what the details are in this absurd competition. Selina smiled slightly as Fleetfoot wagged her tail and licked Nehemia's arm. She had saved her life somehow. Answers for that would come later. So Selina spoke. Cold tea. The following morning, Selina walked back beside Kale, her eyes on the marble floor on the hallway. The sun radiated off the snow in the garden, making the light in the hall nearly blinding. She told Nehemia almost everything. There were certain things she'd never tell anyone, and she hadn't mentioned Cain or the creature either. Nehemia hadn't asked her again what had bitten her hand, but had stayed with her, curled up in bed, as they talked long into the night. Selina, unsure how she'd ever sleep again, now that she knew that what Cain would do, had been grateful for the company. She pulled her cloak tighter around her. The morning was unnaturally frigid. "You're quiet today." Cale kept his gaze ahead of them. "Did you and Dorian have a fight?" "Dorian?" "He stopped by last night, but Nehemia had shooed him off before he could enter the bedroom." "No, I haven't seen him since yesterday morning, after the events of the last night. Yesterday morning seemed like a week ago." "Did you enjoy dancing with him at the ball?" Were his words a bit sharp? She turned to him as they rounded a corner, headed toward a private training room. "You left rather early. I would have thought you'd want to guard me the whole night." "You don't need me to watch you anymore." "I didn't need you to watch me from the start." He shrugged. "Now I know you're not going anywhere." Outside, a howling wind kicked up a flurry of snow, sending a sparkling wave into the air. "I could go back to Endovier." "You won't." "How do you know that?" "I just know." "That gives me heaps of confidence." "This conversation reminds me of a certain someone." He chuckled, continuing towards the sparring room. "I'm surprised your dog didn't run after you for all the crying she did just now." "If you had a pet, you wouldn't make fun," she said gloomily. "I've never had a pet. I never wanted one." "That's probably a blessing for whatever dog might have wound up as your companion." He jabbed her with an elbow. She grinned and elbowed him back. She wanted to tell him about Cain. She wanted to tell him when she saw him at her door this morning. She wanted to tell him everything. But he couldn't know, because she realized last night if she told him about Cain and the creature he'd unleashed, then he'd ask to see the remains of the creature. And that meant taking him into the secret passage. while he might trust her enough to leave her alone with Dorian, knowing that she had access to an unguarded escape route was a test she wasn't ready to give Kale. Besides, I killed it. It's over. Elena's mysterious evil is vanquished. Now I'll just defeat Cain in a duel, and then no one needs to know. Kale stopped before the unmarked door of their practice room and whirled to face her. I'm only going to ask you this once, and then I won't ask it again, he said, staring at her so intensely that she shifted on her feet. Lol, she's naive. Yeah, probably. Do you know what you're getting into with Dorian? She laughed, a harsh, caving noise. Are you giving me romantic advice? And is this for my sake or Dorian's? Both. I didn't realize you cared enough about me to bother, or even notice. To his credit, he didn't take the bait. Instead, he just unlocked the door. Just remember to use your brain, will you? He said over his shoulder and entered the room. An hour later, sweating and still panting from the swordplay practice, Selina wiped her brow on her sleeve as they made their way back to her rooms. The other day I saw you were reading Elric and Emaid, he said. I thought you hated poetry. It's different, she swung her arms. Epic poetry isn't boring or pretentious. Oh, a crooked smile twisted across his face. A poem about massive battles and boundless love isn't pretentious. She playfully punched his shoulder and he laughed. Surprisingly delighted at his laughter, she cackled. But then they turned a corner, and guards filled the hall, and she saw him. The King of Waterland. Chapter 44. Why are you complaining? You are lying on my lap. The king! Selina's heart gave a screech and dove behind her spine. Each of the little scars on her back, on her hand throbbed. Sorry. He strode towards them, his monstrous form filling the too small hallway, and their eyes met. She went cold and hot at once. Kale halted and bowed low. Slowly, not wishing to find herself swinging from the gallows just yet, Selina bowed too. He stared at her with eyes of iron. The hair on her arms rose. She could feel him searching, looking for something inside of her. He knew that something was wrong, that something had changed in his castle. Something to do with her. Selina and Kale rose and stepped aside. His head turned to examine her as he strode past. Could he see what lay beyond her flesh? Did he know that Cain had the ability to open portals? Real portals to other worlds? Did he know that even though he banned magic, the weird mark still commanded a power of their own. Power the king could wield if he learned to summon demons like the Ritterak. There was a darkness in his eyes that felt cold and foreign, like the gaps between the stars. Could one man destroy a world? What was his ambition so consuming? She could hear the din of war. The king's head shifted to look at the hallway ahead. Something dangerous lurked about him. It was an air of death, as she felt standing before the black void summoned by Cain. It was the stench of another world, a dead world. What was Elena's goal in demanding that she get close to him? Selena managed to walk one step at a time away from the king. Her eyes were far away and distant, and though she didn't look at Cale, she felt him studying her face. Thankfully, he didn't say a word. It was nice to have someone who understood. Cale also didn't say anything when she moved closer to him for the remainder of their walk. Cale paced through his room. His time with Selena oh his time with Selena over until she trained with the other champions that afternoon. After lunch, he'd returned to his room to read the report detailing the king's journey, and the past 10 minutes he read the thing 3 times. He crumbled the paper in his fist. Why had the king arrived alone? And more importantly, how had everyone in his traveling party died? It wasn't clear where he'd gone. He mentioned the White Fangs Mountains, but why were they all dead? The king had vaguely hinted at some sort of issue with rebels poisoning their food stores, but the details were murky enough to suggest that the truth was buried somewhere else. Perhaps he hadn't explained it fully because it would upset his subjects, but Cale was his captain of the guard. If the king didn't trust him, the clock struck and Cale's shoulders sagged. Poor Selena. Did she know that she looked like a frightened animal when the king appeared? He'd almost wanted to pat her on the back, and the effect the king had on her lasted long after their encounter. She'd been distant during lunch. She was incredible now. So fast he had difficulty keeping up with her. She could scale a wall with ease, and had even demonstrated by climbing up to her own balcony with nothing but her bare hands. It unnerved him, especially when he remembered she was only 18. He wondered if this was how she'd been before in Deauville. She never hesitated when they sparred, but she seemed to sink far within herself, into a place that was calm and cool, but also angry and burning. She could kill anyone, Cain included, in a matter of seconds. But if she became champion, could they let her loose into Éolair once more? He was fond of her, but Cale didn't know if he could sleep a night knowing that he retrained and released the world's greatest assassin. If she won, though, she'd been here for 4 years. What had the king thought when he saw them together, laughing? Surely that hadn't been his reason for neglecting to tell him what happened to his men. No, the king wouldn't bother to care about that kind of thing, especially if Selena might soon be his champion. Kale rubbed his shoulder. She looked so small when she saw the king. Since returning from his travels, the king hadn't seemed any different, and was just a gruff, with Kale as he'd always been. But the sudden disappearance, then returning without a single soul, there was something brewing. A cauldron that the king had journeyed to stir. Selena somehow knew it too. The captain of the guard leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. He shouldn't press into the king's business. Right now, his focus was on solving the murders of the champions, and on making sure Selena won. It wasn't even about Dorian's pride anymore. Selena wouldn't survive another year in Endovier. Kale smiled slightly. She stirred up enough trouble in the months she'd been in the castle. He could imagine he could only imagine what would happen over the next 4 years. Oh yeah, lover's quarrel, I would say. Oh, I need some more tea, guys. Give me a sec. Chapter 45. Selena panted as she and Nox lowered their swords, the weapons master shouting at the 5 champions to get some water. Tomorrow was the last test before the duel. She kept her distance when Kane lumbered toward the water jug on the table by the far wall, watching his every movement. She eyed his muscle, his height, his girth, all strength stolen from the dead champions. She studied the black ring on his finger. Did it somehow have a connection to his horrible abilities? He hadn't even looked all that surprised to see her alive when she entered the training hall. He'd just given her a small, taunting smile and picked up his practice sword. Is something the matter? Nox said. His breathing ragged as he stopped by her side. Kane, Grave, and Renault were talking amongst themselves. You were a bit off balance. How had Kane learned to summon that creature? And what was that blackness from whence it had appeared? Was it truly just so he could win the competition? Or, Knox continued, do you have other thoughts on your mind? She shoved Kane out of her head. What? He grinned at her. It seemed like you were rather enjoying the Crown Prince's attention at the ball. Mind your own business, she snapped. Knox held up his hands. I didn't mean to pry. She walked to the water jug, not saying a word to Knox, as she poured herself a glass, and didn't bother to offer him one. He leaned in as she set down the jug. Those scars on your hand are new. She stuffed her hand into her pocket, her eyes flashing. Mind your own business, she repeated. She stepped away, but Knox grabbed her arm. You told me to stay in my rooms the other night, and those scars look like bite marks. They say Varen and Xavier were killed by animals. His grey eyes narrowed. You know something. She glanced over her shoulder at Kane, who was joking with Grave as if he weren't a demon-summoning psychopath. There are only 5 of us left. 4 make it to the duels and the tests tomorrow. Whatever happened to Varen and Xavier, it wasn't an accident. Not when their death occurred within 2 days of the tests. She shook her arm out of her grasp. Be careful, she hissed. Tell me what you know. She couldn't, not without sounding insane. If you were smart, you'd get out of this castle. Why? He shot a look at Kane. What aren't you saying? Brullo finished his water and went to retrieve his sword. She didn't have much time before he called them to resume. I'm saying that if I didn't have any other choice but to be here, if it wasn't between this and death, I would be halfway across Ivalea by now, and not looking back. Knox rubbed his neck. I don't understand a word of what you just said. Why don't you have a choice? I know things are bad with your father, but surely he won't. She silenced him with a pointed stare. And you're not a jewel thief, are you? She shook her head. Knox glanced again at Kane. Kane's nose too. That's why he always tries to rile you, to get you to show who you truly are. She nodded. What difference did it make if he knew? She had more important things to worry about now, like how she'd survive until the duels, or stop Kane. But who are you? Knox said. She bit her lip. You said your father moved you to Endovier. That much is true. The prince went there to retrieve you. There's evidence of that journey. Even as he said it, his eyes slid towards her back. She could practically see the revelations as they bloomed in his mind. And you weren't in the town of Endovier. You were in Endovier. The salt mines. That explains why you were so painfully thin when I first saw you. Rollo clapped his hands. Come on, you lot. Drills! Knox and Selina remained by the table. His eyes were wide. You were a slave in Endovier. She couldn't form the words to confirm it. Knox was too smart for his own good. But you're barely a woman. What did you do to... His gaze fell on Kale and the guards who stood near him. Would I have heard your name before? Would I have heard that you were shipped to Endovier? Yes, everyone heard when I went, she breathed, and watched as he sorted through every name he ever heard associated with the place. Then put the pieces together. He took a step back. You're a girl? Surprising, I know. Everyone thinks I'm older. Knox ran a hand through his black hair. And you can either be the king's champion or go back to Endovier? That's why I can't leave. Brullo shouted at them to start their drills. And why I'm telling you to get out of the castle while you can. She took her hand from her pocket and showed it to him. I received this from a creature I can't even begin to describe to you, nor would you believe me if I tried. But there are 5 of us now, and because the test is tomorrow, that means one more night we are at risk. Ow! You! Claws out of my lap, please. I don't understand any of this, Knox said, still keeping back a step. You don't have to. But you are not going back to prison if you fail. And you're not going to be the champion, even if you make it to the duels. So you need to leave. Do I want to know what's killing the champions? She fought her shudder as she recalled the fangs and stench of the creature. No, she said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. You don't. You just have to trust me and trust that I'm not trying to eliminate my competition by tricking you. Whatever he read in her expression made his shoulders sag. All of this time, I thought you were just some pretty girl from Benhaven who stole jewels to get her father's attention. Little did I know that the blonde-haired girl was queen of the underworld. He smiled ruefully. Thank you for warning me. You could have opted to say nothing. You were the only one who bothered to take me seriously, she said, smiling with warmth that she meant. I'm surprised you even believe me. Brollo shouted at them, and they began walking back to the group. Kale's eyes were hard upon them. She knew he'd question her about their conversation later. Do me a favor, Selina, Knox said. The sound of her name startled her. He brought his mouth close to her ear. Rip Kane's head off, he whispered with a wicked grin. Selina only smiled back at him and nodded. Knox left early that night, slipping out of the castle without a word to anyone. The clock chimed 5, and Caltaine fought the urge to rub her eyes as the opiums oozed through every pore of her body. In the light of the setting sun, the castle hallways were awash with red and orange and gold, the colors bleeding together. Parrington had asked her to join his dinner table in the great hall, and she normally wouldn't have dared to smoke before a public meal. But the headache that had plagued her all afternoon hadn't gotten any better. The hall seemed to stretch on forever. She ignored the passing courtiers and servants, focusing instead on the fading day. Someone approached from the other end, a smear of black against the gold and orange lights. Shadow seemed to leak from him, flowing into the stones and the windows and the walls like spilled ink. She tried to swallow as she neared him, but found her tongue to be leaden and paper dry. Each step brought him closer, made him bigger and taller. and her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Perhaps the opium has gone bad. Perhaps she smoked too much this time. Amid the pounding in her ears and her head, the whisper of wings filled the air. In the space between blinks, she could have sworn she saw things swooping past him in swift, vicious circles, hovering above him, waiting, waiting, waiting. "Milady?" Kane said, bowing his head as he strode by. Beltane said nothing. She clenched her sweaty palms and continued towards the great hall. It took a while for the sound of flapping wings to fade, but by the time she reached the Duke's table, she had forgotten all about it. After dinner that night, Selina sat across the chessboard from Dorian. The kiss following the ball 2 days ago hadn't been so bad. Nice, actually, if she was being honest. Of course he returned tonight, and so far there had been no mention of the fresh scars on her hand, or the kiss. And she never, not in a million years, tell him about the Riderack. She might feel something for him, but if he told his father about the power of the weird marks and weird gates, her blood chilled at the thought. But looking at him, with his face illuminated by firelight, she couldn't see any resemblance to his father. No, she could only see his kindness and intelligence. And maybe he was a tad arrogant, but meh. Selina's toes scratched Fleetfoot's ears. She expected him to stay away, to move on to another woman now that he'd tasted her. Well, did he even want to taste you in the first place? He moved his high priestess, and Selina laughed. "Do you really wish to do that?" she asked. His face contorted with confusion, and she picked up her pawn, moving it diagonally, and easily knocked over the piece. "Damn!" he cried, and she cackled. "Here," she handed him the piece. "Take it and try another move." "No, I'll play like a man and accept my losses." They laughed, but silence soon crept over them. A smile still played about her lips, and he reached for her hand. She wanted to pull it away, but couldn't bring herself to do it. He held her hand over the board and smoothly flattened their palms against each other, interlocking his fingers with hers. His hand was callous but sturdy. Their entwined hands rested on the side of the table. "One needs both hands to play chess," she said, wondering if it were possible for her heart to explode. Fleetfoot huffed and trotted away, probably to disappear under the bed. "I think you're the only one need. I... Oh, come on, read properly. I think you only need one." He moved the piece all over the board. "See?" She chewed her lip. Still she didn't pull her hand from his. "Are you going to kiss me again?" "I'd like to." She couldn't move as he leaned toward her, closer and closer, the table groaning beneath him until he stopped, his lips just hair's breadth from hers. I ran into your father in the hall today, she blurted. Dorian slowly sat back in his chair. And? And it was fine, she lied. His eyes narrowed. He lifted her chin with a finger. You didn't say that to avoid the inevitable, did you? No, she said that just to keep talking, to keep him here as long as he would be willing to stay, so she didn't have to face the night alone with the threat of Cain hovering over her. Who better to keep her at her side in the dark hours of the night than the son of the king? Cain wouldn't dare to harm him. But all of this, everything that had happened with the riddle rack, meant all the books she read were true. What if Cain could summon anything to him, like the dead? There were many people who lost their fortunes when magic vanished. Even the king himself might be intrigued by this sort of power. You are trembling, Dorian said. She was. Like a damned idiot, she was trembling. Are you all right? He moved around the table to sit beside her. She couldn't tell him. No, he could never know. Just as he couldn't know that when she checked under her bed before dinner, there were fresh chalk marks for her to wash away. Cain knew that she discovered how he was eliminating the competition. Perhaps he'd hunt her down tonight, or perhaps not. She hadn't the faintest idea. But she'd get little sleep tonight, or till Cain was impaled on the end of her sword. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was little more than a whisper. But if he kept asking, she was bound to tell him. Are you sure you're feeling? He began, but she surged forward and kissed him. Something tells me that some drama will happen in the final duel day. Yeah, you're probably right, Jay. She almost knocked him to the floor, but he shot out an arm to the back of the chair and braced himself as his spare arm wrapped around her middle. She let the touch, the taste of him, fill the room of her mind with water. She kissed him, hoping to steal some of his air. Her fingers entangled themselves in his hair, and as he kissed her fiercely, she let everything fade away. The clock chimed 3. Selina sat on her bed, nails curled to her chest. After hours of kissing and talking and more kissing on her bed, Dorian had left only minutes before. She'd been tempted to ask him to stay. The smart thing would have been to ask him to stay, but the thought of Dorian being here when Cain or the Ridderat came for her, of Dorian being hurt, made her let him go. Too tired to read, but too awake to sleep, she just stared at the crackling fire. Every bump and step made her jolt, and she managed to swipe a few pins from Philippa's sewing basket when she wasn't looking. But a makeshift knife, a heavy book, and a candlestick weren't protection against what Cain could summon. She shouldn't have left the Maris in the tomb. Going back down there wasn't an option, not while Cain lived. She hugged her knees, shivering as she recalled the utter blackness from which the thing had come. Cain must have learned about the weird marks in the White Fang Mountains. That cursed borderland between Ardalan and the western wastes. They said that evil still crept out of the ruins of the witch kingdom, and that old women with iron teeth still wandering the lonely roads in the mountain passes. The hair on her arm rose, and she grabbed a fur blanket from her bed to wrap around herself. If she could stay alive until the duels, she'd defeat Cain, and this would all be over. Then she could sleep soundly again, unless Elena had something else bigger in mind. Hmm, yeah. Selina rested her cheek against her knee, listening to the clock tick, tick, tick long into the night. Thundering hooves beat the frozen ground, faster and faster. Oh, give me a sec. I'm back, and where were we? Oh yeah. Thundering hooves beat the frozen ground faster and faster as the rider whipped the horse. Snow and mud lay thick on the earth, and rogue snowflakes drifted through the sky. Selina ran, swifter than her young legs could manage. Everything hurt. Trees ripped at her dress and hair. Stones sliced her feet. She scrambled through the woods, breathing so hard she couldn't muster the air to cry for help. She must reach the bridge. It couldn't cross the bridge. Behind her, a sword shrieked as it was drawn from its sheath. She fell, slamming into the mud and rock. The sound of the approaching demon filled the air as she struggled to rise, but the mud held fast, and she could not run. Reaching for a bush, her small hands bleeding, the horse now close behind, she... Selina gasped and woke. She put a hand to her heart and pushed against her chest as it lifted and fell. It was a dream. The fire had dwindled to embers. A cold grey light seeped in through her curtains. It was only a nightmare. She must have dozed off at some point during the night. She clutched her amulet, running a thumb across the stone in the center. Some protection you were when that thing attacked me the other night. Frowning, she gently arranged her covers around Fleetfoot and stroked the dog's head for a moment. Dawn was near. She made it through another night. Sighing, Selina lay back and closed her eyes. A few hours later, when news of Nox's departure spread, she received notice that the last test had been cancelled. She would duel against Grave, Renault, and Kane tomorrow. Tomorrow, and then her freedom would be decided. Chapter 46. The forest was still and frozen around Dorian, and snow collapsed from the trees in large clumps as he passed by. His eyes darted among the branches and bushes. He needed to come out for a hunt today, if only to let the freezing air rush through him. He saw her face each time he closed his eyes. She haunted his thoughts, made him wish to do grand and wonderful things in her name, made him want to be a man who deserved to wear a crown. But Selina, he didn't know how she felt. She kissed him, greedily at that. But the women he loved in the past had always been eager. They gazed at him adoringly, while she just looked at him like a cat watching a mouse. Dorian straightened, detecting nearby movement. A stag stood 10 yards away, feeding on bark. He stopped his horse and drew an arrow from his quiver. But he slackened the bow. She was to duel tomorrow. If harm came to her... No, she could hold her own. She was strong. And smart and quick. He'd gone too far. He should never have kissed her, because now, no matter how he might have once envisioned his future, or who he thought he spent it with, he couldn't imagine being with anyone else, wanting anyone else. Cancelled is like so stimming, yeah. Selina stood before her balcony doors, staring down at Rifthold. The roofs were still snow-covered, and lights twinkled in every home. It might have looked beautiful, but she not known what corruption and filth dwelt within it, and what monstrosity ruled over it all. She hoped Knox was far, far away. She told her guards she didn't want any visitors tonight, and to turn away even Cale and Dorian if they arrived. Someone had knocked once, but she didn't answer, and they had soon left without trying again. She put her hand on a pane of glass, savoring its frozen bite. The clock struck 12. Tomorrow, or was it today already, she'd face Kane. She'd never sparred with him in practice. The other champions had been too eager to get a piece at him. While Kane was strong, he wasn't as fast as she was, but he had stamina. She'd have to dodge him for a while. She just prayed all that running with Cale would keep her from tiring before him. If she lost, don't even give yourself that option, Selena thought to herself. She leaned her forehead against the glass. Would it be more honorable to fall in a duel than to return to Endovier? Or would it be more honorable to die than to become the king's champion? Who would he have her to kill? She had a say. Dodge roll to win, yeah. She had a say as Ardalan's assassin, even with Arobin Hamel running her life. She'd always had a say in what job she took. No children, no one from Terrassen, but the king could tell her to kill anyone. Did Elena expect her to say no to him when she was his champion? Her stomach rose in her throat. Now wasn't the time for this. She had to focus on Kane, on wearing him down. But try as she might, all she could think about was that half-starved, hopeless assassin who had been dragged out of Endovier one autumn day by a snarling captain of the guard. Hey, No Limit! How are you today? What would she have said to the Princess Bargain had she known she would come to stand poised to lose so much? Oh, a bit tired because my new puppy kept me up all night. Oh, how old is it? And what kind of breed? Oh, 50 days. Would she have laughed if she'd known that the other things, other people, would come to as her mean so much as her freedom? Westie Highland White Terrier. Oh, that's so sweet. Selena swallowed the lump in her throat. Perhaps there were other reasons to fight tomorrow. Perhaps a few months in the castle hadn't been enough. Perhaps, perhaps she wanted to stay here for reasons other than her eventual freedom. That was one of the hopeless assassins from Endovier would have never believed. But it was true. She wanted to stay. And that would make tomorrow so much harder. Yeah, you know, girls and their minds. Chapter 47. This is gonna be last chapter, guys. Caltaine pulled her red cape around her, savoring in its warmth. Why were the duels outside? She'd freeze before the assassin arrived. She fingered the vial in her pocket and glanced at the two goblets on the wooden table. The one on her right was for Sardathian. She must not confuse them. She looked to Parrington, who stood near the king. He had no idea what she'd do once Sardathian was out of the way, once Dorian was free again. Her blood grew warm and glittering. The Duke moved toward her, and Caltaine kept her eyes on the tile veranda where the duel was to occur. He stopped in front of her. making a wall between her and the other council members so that none could see. A bit chilly for an outside duel, he said. Kaltain smiled and let the folds of her cloak fall over the table as he kissed her hand. With a veil of red to conceal her stealthy free hand, Kaltain flicked off the lid of the vial and dumped the contents into the wine. The vial was back in her pocket as he raised himself, just enough to weaken Sardothian, to make her dizzy and disoriented. A guard appeared in the doorway, and then another. Between them strode a figure. She wore men's clothes, though Kaltain was forced to admit that her black and gold jacket was of fine make. It was strange to think of this woman as an assassin, but seeing her now, all of her oddities and faults made sense. Kaltain ran a finger along the base of the goblet and grinned. Duke Parrington's champion emerged from behind the clock tower. Kaltain's brows rose. They thought Sardothian could defeat such a man if she wasn't drugged? Kaltain took a step back from the table, and Parrington moved to sit beside the king as the other two champions arrived. With eager faces, they waited for blood. Standing on the wide veranda that encompassed the obsidian clock tower, Selina tried not to shiver. She couldn't see the point in having the duels outside. Well, apart from making the champions even more uncomfortable, she glanced longingly at the glass window that lined the wall of the castle, and then at the frost-covered garden. Her hands were already numb. Tucking them into her fur-lined pockets, she approached Kael, who was standing near the edge of the giant chalked circle that had been drawn onto the flagstones. "It's freezing out here," she said. The collar and sleeves of her black jacket were lined with rabbit fur, but it wasn't enough. "Why didn't you tell me it was outside?" Kael shook his head, looking at Grave and at Renaud, the mercenary from Skull's Bay, who, to her satisfaction, also seemed fairly miserable in the cold. "We didn't know. The king decided just now," Kael said. "At least it should be over quickly." He smiled slightly, though she didn't return it. The sky was bright blue, and she gritted her teeth as a strong gust of wind ripped into her. The 13 seats of the table were filling up. In the center of the table sat the king and Parrington. Kaltain stood behind Parrington, wearing a beautiful red cloak, lined with white fur. Their eyes met, and Selina wondered why the woman smiled at her. Kaltain looked away, towards the tower, and Selina followed her gaze and understood. Kane was leaning against the clock tower. His muscles were barely contained within his tunic. All that stolen strength. What would have happened if the Redorak had killed her too? How much stronger would he be today? Worse, he was wearing the red and gold garb of a member of the Royal Guard. The wayward emblazoned across his broad chest. The sword at his side was beautiful, though. A gift from Parrington, no doubt. Did the Duke know the power his champion wielded? Even if she tried to reveal him, no one would ever believe her. Nausea gripped her, but Cale took her by the elbow and escorted her to the far end of the veranda. At the table, she noticed two aging men casting anxious glances at her. She nodded to them. Lords Urizen and Garnell, it seemed you obtained what you desire enough to kill for, and it seems someone told you who I actually am. It had been 2 years ago that they hired her, separately, to kill the same man. She hadn't bothered to tell them, of course, and accepted both their payments. She winked at Lord Garnell, and he paled, knocking over his goblet of hot cocoa and ruining the papers before him. Oh, she kept their secrets. It would tarnish her reputation otherwise. But if her freedom came down to a vote, she smiled at Lord Urizen, who looked up. Her gaze shifted to another man, who she found staring at her. The king. Deep inside, she quaked, but she bowed her head. Are you ready? Cale asked. Selina blinked, remembered that he was beside her. Yes, she said, though she didn't mean it. The wind whipped through her hair, knotting it with frozen fingers. Dorian appeared by the table, heartbreakingly handsome as always, and gave her a grim smile as he stuffed his hands into his pocket and looked towards his father. The last of the king's councilmen sat down at the table. Selina cocked her head as Nehemia emerged to stand along the sidelines of the large white circle. The princess met her stare and lifted her chin in encouragement. She wore a spectacular outfit, close-fitting pants, a layered tunic studded with whorls of iron, and knee-high boots. She carried her wooden staff, which stretched as high as her head. To honor her, Selina realized her eyes stinging, one fellow warrior acknowledging the other. Everyone grew silent as the king rose. Her insides turned to stone, and she felt clumsy and thick, but also light and weak as a newborn. Cale nudged her with an elbow, motioning for her to stand before the table. She focused on her feet and moved, and wouldn't look at the king's face. Thankfully, Renault and Grave flanked her. If Kane had been standing beside her, she might have snapped his neck just to end it there. There were so many people watching her. She stood not 10 feet from the king of Ardalan. Freedom or death lay at his table. Her past and future were seated on a glass throne. Her gaze shifted to Nehemia, whose fierce and graceful eyes warmed the marrow of her bones and steadied her arms. The king of Ardalan spoke. Knowing that seeing his face would only weaken the strength she found in Nehemia's eyes, she looked not at him, but at the throne behind him. She wondered if Caltain's presence meant that Duke Parrington had told her who Selina truly was. You were taken from your miserable lives so you might prove yourself worthy of becoming a sacred warrior to the crown. After months of training, the moment has come to decide who my champion shall be. You will face each other in a duel. You can only you can win only by trapping your opponent in a position of sure death, and no further, he added with a sharp glance in her direction. Kane and Councilman Garnell's champion will go first. Then my son's champion will face Councilman Mollison's champion. Of course the king would know Kane's name. He might as well have just declared the brute his champion. The winners will face each other in a final duel. Whoever wins will be the crowned king's champion. Is that clear? They nodded. For a heartbeat, she saw the king with stark clarity. He was just a man with too much power. And in that one heartbeat, she didn't fear him. I will not be afraid, she vowed, wrapping the familiar words around her heart. Then let the duels commence on my command, the king said. Taking that as a sign that she could clear out of the ring, Selina stalked to where Cale stood and took up a place beside him. Kane and Renault bowed to the king, then to each other, and drew their swords. She ran an eye down Renault's body as she took his stance. She had seen him square off against Kane before. He had never won, but he always managed to hold out longer than she would have thought possible. Perhaps he would win. But Kane lifted his sword. He had the better weapon, and he had half a foot on Renault. Begin, the king said. Metal flashed. They struck each other and danced back. Renault, refusing to take up the defensive, swept forward again, landing a few strong blows on Kane's blade. She focused her shoulders to relax, forced herself to breathe down the cold air. Do you think it was just poor luck, she murmured to Cale, that I'm the one going second? He kept his attention on the duel. I think you'll be allowed proper time to rest. He jerked his thin chin at the dueling men. Kane sometimes forgets to guard his right side. Look there. Selina watched as Kane struck, twisting his body so his right side was wide open. Renault doesn't even notice. Kane grunted and pressed Renault's blade, forcing the mercenary to take a step back. He just missed his chance. The wind roared around them. Keep your wits about you, Cale said, still watching the duel. Renault was retreating. Each swing of Kane's blade took him closer and closer to the line of chalk that had been drawn on the ground. One step outside that ring and he'd be disqualified. He'll try to provoke you. Don't get angry. Focus only on his blade and that unprotected side of his. I know, she said, and shifted her gaze back to the duel, just in time to see Renault cry out and stumble back. Blood sprayed from his nose, and he hit the ground hard. His fist smeared with Renault's blood. I only smiled as he pointed the blade at Renault's heart. The mercenaries. Be right back. And I'm back. Where were we? Oh yeah. The mercenary's bloody face went white, and he bared his teeth as he stared up at his conqueror. She looked at the clock tower. He hadn't lasted 3 minutes. Yes, drama. There were polite clapping, and Selina noticed that Lord Scarnell's face was set with fury. She could only guess how much money he just lost. A valiant effort, said the king. Kane bowed and didn't offer Renaud a hand to help him rise, before he stalked towards the opposite end of the veranda. With more dignity than Selina had expected, Renaud got to his feet and bowed to the king, mumbling his thanks. Clutching his nose, the mercenary slunk away. What had he stood to lose, and where would he return to now? Across the ring, Graves smiled at her as as he wrapped a hand around his hilt of his sword. She bit down on her grimace at the sight of his teeth. Of course she had to duel the grotesque one. At least Renaud had been clean-looking. "We will begin in a moment," the king said. "Prepare your weapons." With that, he turned to Powhatan and began speaking too quietly for anyone else to hear in the blustering wind. Selina turned to Cale, but instead of handing her the plain as porous sword she usually wielded in practice, he drew his own blade. The eagle-shaped pommel glinted in the midday sun. "Here," he said. She blinked at the blade and slowly raised her face to look at him. She found the rolling earthen hills of the north in his eyes. It was a sense of loyalty to his country that went beyond the man seated at the table. Far inside of her, she found a golden chain that bound them together. "Take it," he said. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She lifted a hand to grab the blade, but someone touched her elbow. "If I may," Nehemia said in Elway, "I'd like to offer this to you instead." The princess held out her beautifully carved iron-tipped staff. Selina glanced between Cale's sword and her friend's weapon. The sword, obviously, was the wiser choice, and for Cale to offer his own weapon made her feel strangely light-headed. But the staff... Nehemia leaned in to whisper in Selina's ear. "Let it be with an Ailway weapon that you take them down." Her voice hitched. "Let wood from the forest of Ailway defeat steel from Ardalan. Let the king's champion be someone who understands how the innocent suffer." Hadn't Elena said almost the same thing all those months ago? Selena swallowed hard, and Kale lowered his sword. Taking a step back from them, Nehemia didn't break her stare. She knew what the princess was asking of her. As the king's champion, she might find ways to save countless lives, ways to undermine the king's authority. And that, Selena realized, was what Elena, the king's own ancestor, might want too. Though a bolt of fear went through her, and the thought, though standing against the king was the one thing Selena had thought she'd never be brave enough to do. She couldn't forget the 3 scars on her back, or the slaves she left in Endovier, or the 500 butchered Aelway rebels. Selena took the staff from Nehemia's hands. The princess gave her a fierce grin. Kale, surprisingly enough, didn't object. He only sheathed his sword and bowed his head to Nehemia as she clapped Selena on the shoulder before she walked off. Selena gave the staff a few experimental sweeps in the space around her. Balanced, solid, strong. The rounded iron tip could knock a man out cold. She could feel the lingering oil from Nehemia's hands and smell her friend's lotus blossom scent on the engraved wood. Yes, the staff would do just fine. She'd taken down Varen with her bare hands. She could defeat Grave and Cain with this. She glanced at the king, who was still speaking with Parrington, and found Dorian watching her instead. His sapphire eyes reflected the brilliance of the sky, though they darkened slightly as he flicked them towards Nehemia. Dorian was many things, but he wasn't stupid. Had he realized the symbolism in Nehemia's offer? She quickly dropped his stare. She'd worry about that later. Across the ring, Grave began pacing, waiting for the king to return his attention to the duel, and gave the order to begin. She loosed a shuddered breath. Here she was at long last. She gripped the staff in her left hand, taking in the strength of the wood, the strength of her friend. A lot could happen in a few minutes. A lot could change. She faced Kale. The wind ripped a few strands of hair from her braid, and she tucked them behind her ears. No matter what happens, she said quietly, I want to thank you. Kale tilted his head to the side. For what? Her eyes stung, but she blamed it on the fierce wind and blinked away the dampness. For making my freedom mean something. He didn't say anything. He just took the finger of her right hand and held them in his thumb brushing the ring she wore. Let the second duel commence, the king boomed, waving a hand toward the veranda. Kale squeezed her hand, his skin warm in the frigid air. Give him hell, he said. Grave entered the ring and drew his sword. Pulling her hand from Kale's, Selena straightened her spine as she stepped into the ring. She quickly bowed to the king, then to her opponent. She met grave stare, and smiled as she bent her knees, holding the staff in two hands. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, little man. Alright, guys, that was it. What a turn of event, huh, guys? So, hopefully, my internet will be up and running completely next Monday, and we can finish the book. Then, we need to figure out what to read next. If we should continue the second book, or if we should read something completely other fantasy series, or if we should read some ESO lore. Um, oh, you're welcome, Jay. You are so welcome. Um, I have hoped you guys haven't fallen asleep with me reading. Um, but it is time for me to go. And thank you so much, guys, for the follows, for your support, for being here, listening to me rambling on, reading a book. Um, we're gonna raid. We're gonna raid Heidi. Um, so thank you guys for today, and I will see you guys soon. Oh, you're welcome, Vertigo. I hope you are relaxed enough now to go to sleep. Take care, guys. Remember, I love you all. Good night. Yes, go to bed. Wait, what? He's offline. He just went offline. What the F? No! Oh my god, no. Well, then let's find someone else. Mm. Oh my god. Let's see if we can rate someone else. Who is let's see. I don't know this person. Let's see who it is. Oh, I can't unraid. I'm sorry, guys. I promise you guys I will raid someone else next time. That is not going offline. Bye bye, guys.